Well, this is the time for the last award of the evening. And I have to go to the envelope for that. And I will. Here it comes. And my eyes see Oppenheimer.
Christopher Nolan's 3-hour, $100 million biopic about J. Robert Oppenheimer is one of the most visually impressive movies he's probably ever made. In terms of visuals alone, this film is a true masterpiece, in which Nolan's capabilities in that regard have certainly reached a peak. However, from the perspective of story and narrative, Nolan's masterpiece is a complete disaster. I have personally never seen such a beautiful film tell such a disjointed story so poorly. The level of malfunction in this film's storytelling is particularly impressive when you consider the size of its budget and the seemingly bottomless well of resources from which Nolan could draw in terms of talent. Despite all those resources and all his years of experience and shelves of accolades, Nolan has managed somehow to exact such a litany of offenses against the art of storytelling in the course of these 3 excruciating hours that sitting through the thing feels more like an endurance test. It certainly doesn't feel like entertainment. Before we get into a full examination of his failures and mistakes, I should say this. In my opinion, it isn't possible to make a movie about historical figures or events that is both entertaining and historically accurate. I have personally only heard historians praise the broad accuracy of one Hollywood film, and that was the 2004 Alexander biopic starring Colin Farrell, which I did watch somehow without passing out. As I understand it, it was painstakingly true to accepted historical knowledge. But in spite of that, or because of it, it was a terrible slog of a film. Real life doesn't lend itself well to narrative arcs and even pacing. And outside of that, historical inaccuracies, while they might sour the experience for anyone with even a passing knowledge of the history as it happened, do not themselves constitute bad storytelling. I've seen Hollywood films about historical figures that were so far removed from the facts that they were entirely fictional. But they were also very good movies. Why? Because they told a story. A fictional story, mind you, very well. Because at the end of the day, any film, no matter the subject matter or genre, must do only one thing well: tell a story. I want to make this abundantly clear. This is not going to be a video about whether or not Nolan's film is true to historical facts. I won't be getting into historical accuracy or inaccuracy. That is, let me be clear, not my area. There are dozens, probably hundreds of videos by now on YouTube that thoroughly dissect the historical aspect of the Oppenheimer film, made by people far more qualified to speak on the topic than I am. When it comes to history, if there's electricity and men are wearing neckties, I probably don't know that much, given that my interest is ancient and medieval history. But again, not really relevant to storytelling. Additionally, this is also not going to be a video about whether or not Oppenheimer is a good film in terms of cinematography, lighting, framing, acting, music, etc., etc. Once again, not my area. And if I'm being completely honest, in terms of good storytelling, things like set design, costumes, special effects, these would probably fall firmly in the category of neither here nor there. My area is storytelling. And it is in his storytelling that Nolan's failure with Oppenheimer is the most glaring. It took me 3 watches to break down in my mind the specific places and ways this story fails. The whole 3-hour thing was such a disjointed mess that I felt like I'd been handed a box of puzzle pieces that could make 2 or 3 separate images, but I had no way of knowing what those images were even supposed to be. Which leads us to our first and most glaring problem: pacing and complexity. And when it comes to complexity, Nolan's in this film was on a Byzantine level, both in terms of its overabundance and the way it had a tendency to undermine itself. A helpful rule about complexity is that it must be limited. And the way you limit complexity is to balance it with simplicity. So if your cast of characters is massive and complexly interconnected, then you should keep the narrative flow itself fairly straightforward. Conversely, if your story has a half dozen or more overlapping perspectives or timelines, then you should try to keep your cast of characters pretty limited. Complexity is pleasantly challenging both to write and read or watch, but too much complexity or complexity in too many areas can lead to so much confusion that the story itself is weighed down by the audience's need to puzzle everything out just so they know what's going on. At that point, they have no time or mental bandwidth to care about the characters or get invested in the events as they're playing out. This is where you'll run into issues where, for instance, a character's identity isn't clear enough to the audience to allow them to care whether or not they live or die in a particularly climactic scene. And this will just annoy your audience, or even worse, bore them. A writer has to be prudent in their use of complexity and ambiguity. I'm not the first person, nor will I be the last, to point out that Christopher Nolan has become far too reliant on his unconventional, increasingly complex, non-linear approach to narrative. I would go so far as to claim that this strategy only really worked for him twice. The first was his 2000 film Memento starring Guy Pearce, in which the entire story was told in reverse. And the second, of course, was Inception. A big part of the success of the nonlinear timelines here was the fact that both films featured time itself as a major plot point, as in Interstellar, though that plot was a lot more linear than these two other examples. In all of his films since then, these strange timeline decisions have felt more like a gimmick than an actual contribution to the narrative or the way in which the narrative is delivered. And in Oppenheimer, this particular narrative strategy did a tremendous amount of damage to an already flagging story. So in order to analyze that, we need to take a quick look at the three timelines at play in this film. The first, let's call it the linear biographical timeline, begins long before World War II, when J. Robert Oppenheimer was still just a university student struggling to cope with genius, mental instability, academic humiliation, and the general pain of coming into his own intellectually. This timeline continued through his journeys across European academia until he returned home to America to start his own celebrated teaching career. It then brought us into World War II and the splitting of the atom, and then, of course, the Manhattan Project. It wrapped up somewhere around the dropping of the bombs on Japan. The second timeline, let's call this one the security hearing timeline, takes place some years after the war when Oppenheimer's security clearance is being thoroughly reevaluated by the Gray Board. This security hearing timeline was meant to act as a kind of contextual clearinghouse for the information that was being revealed in the course of the first timeline, the biographical timeline. That seemed to be the intent, but it failed to do this. The third and final timeline, we'll call it the Strauss timeline, takes place at a time loosely understood to be 4 or 5 years after the security clearance reevaluation. This one, for no particular reason, is filmed in black and white and features prominently Robert Downey Jr. playing the role of Louis Strauss, who is up for a cabinet appointment as Secretary of Commerce and is being himself routinely evaluated by the appropriate subcommittee. Given his involvement in Oppenheimer's life, especially after the war, this evaluation is dominated by questions about that. These three timelines are interspersed largely at random. Occasionally, there is an overlapping notion that kind of binds them together for 2 or 3 minutes, but these instances are rare enough to feel almost accidental. The Strauss timeline, for example, features an account of Oppenheimer's actions and behavior from Strauss's unreliable perspective, as they occurred somewhere near the end of the biographical timeline, and leading up to the evaluation of the security hearing timeline. Meanwhile, the security hearing timeline relates and sometimes repeats, not always in any particular chronological order, the events of the biographical timeline. At this point, I feel a little confused explaining this, so I wouldn't be surprised if you're a little confused listening to me, and that's my problem here. There was no need for this to be this confusing. All these overlapping, interconnected timelines offer nothing to the narrative, to our understanding of the events, to our understanding of the character's development. All it does is force the audience to work double time, trying to keep all the events straight. When every scene opens, we have to take several valuable seconds trying to understand where this scene fits in the narrative, whether it happened before or after everything else we've seen thus far. And during those valuable seconds, we've missed either plot details or emotional information. The audience can be made to work hard to understand a story as the writer is delivering it, and most audiences will really enjoy doing so. But the audience should never be made to work longer to understand a story. The writer has to know for certain how hard the average audience member is working to understand a bit of his clever ambiguity, and he has to gauge whether or not it's too much. The writer can make things just the right amount of vague, but that cannot undermine the surrounding narrative information. Among the many things not made clear is which of these three timelines is the film's present, which could seem like a somewhat irrelevant concern to have about a film that is set entirely in our past, but the issue is that the film itself isn't grounded anywhere. There is no solid home base, so to speak. Initially, I expected the security hearing timeline to be the film's present, from which solid position we would occasionally reach back into the past. However, chronologically, the timeline that takes place the latest, the black and white Strauss timeline, would probably be the present, but that hardly seems likely considering that the events depicted there felt more like an unnecessary epilogue to the events of the other two timelines, and didn't really offer any kind of solid ground from which the other two timelines could be conveniently accessed. In order to tell a story successfully, you have to bring in the reader or the audience. Give them a nice comfortable chair to sit in, put a blanket on their lap, offer them a nice cup of hot cocoa. Then and only then you launch them into the world you've created. If you've written your story well, they wouldn't even be aware of the chair or the blanket or you. We've all had those experiences where we finish reading a book and look up and we're not really even completely sure what planet we're on, but that's only possible because the writer has made us comfortable and secure within the solid groundwork of the story. One of the hardest, most overlooked, and most essential aspects of telling a story is laying solid groundwork. It's the housekeeping of storytelling. It's the roof over your head and the warm hearth and the running water. It's the things you don't notice unless they're absent, at which point they become so distracting that you have no idea or appreciation for the fact that your rug is a priceless antique, or that there are crystals hanging from the chandelier. No one cares about that stuff when there's nowhere to sit and it's raining on their heads. Lack of solid ground in Nolan's Oppenheimer isn't the world's biggest problem by any means, but it unfortunately lays the shaky foundation for the instability that would plague the rest of the story. If you're using multiple chronological timelines to tell a story, then one of them has to be base camp. A very straightforward example of this would be a story that opens with an old dying man telling his life story to a visitor. The opening scene begins his account, and then the rest of the story is the story as he tells it. At the end, or perhaps occasionally throughout the narrative, we could return to the old man and his visitor. And we're returning because this is home camp, and we need to, as the writers, remind the audience of the chronological context of the rest of the events. What if, for instance, the old man is telling a story about how he rose to become a king, or a ruling statesman? What if the room in which he's telling this story to his visitor is a jail cell? Then you've accomplished ambiguity and confusion, but without undermining the narrative details of the story the man is telling. Wondering why he's in a jail cell isn't going to prevent us from understanding how he went from being a common baker's son to being the king, or whatever. Pardon my creative digression, but I think it's helpful to really examine specifically why Nolan's use of multiple timelines didn't work in Oppenheimer. All of these timelines were doubtless meant to reinforce each other, but instead they undercut each other. The three were so weak that when they leaned against each other, their individual uncertainty damaged the cohesion of the others. And this weakness came from primarily a lack of focus. Where was the main avenue of Nolan's narrative? Which timeline was his home base? Contextually, how did they interconnect both chronologically and thematically? These were all areas where he failed, and his failure probably came from the fact that he himself likely couldn't answer these questions. Thus, the ambiguity in his finished narrative wasn't ambiguity, it was accidental confusion, which would have probably been avoidable had he decided not to use more than one timeline. I'm going to cover this a little more later, but a part of this problem of his is that he couldn't focus on any particular part of Oppenheimer's life and seems to almost be trying to cover all of it. But I mean, as any storyteller knows, no individual's life supports the structure of a single story. No one has a life that follows a single comfortable narrative arc. Therefore, people who make films that aren't documentaries about some historical subject, and people who write similar books that aren't comprehensive biographies or history books, need to limit the scope of the story they're going to tell. A story about D-Day, for example, cannot possibly be told from every perspective in a single film or book. You could tell the story from the perspective of the politicians in Washington, or from the espionage agents who were working in the shadows to keep it secret, or the nurses in the medical tents, or the soldiers on the beach. You could even tell the story from the perspective of the Germans. In any case, the events relayed, the way they're told, the areas of emphasis are all going to be different. This is more a matter of framing, which we'll get into more later. One of the most damaging aspects of Nolan's multiple timelines approach was that it destroyed the flow of continuity of Robert Oppenheimer's character development. We see him first in the security hearing timeline, meek and apologetic, receiving the distrust and indignation of the Gray Board, so named, by the way, for its chair, Gordon Gray. And then we see him in the past, during his biographical timeline, as a student, self-assured and quick to anger. Then we see him in snippets during the black and white third timeline, the Strauss timeline, in which he seems arrogant if gracious, but otherwise certain of his place in history. This all within the first several minutes of the film. Once the story enters its stride, insofar as it had one, these jumps become more and more jarring and disorienting. The crucial road of development in the chronological course of his life was repeatedly interrupted by superimposed images of him in the future. If this was meant to hint ominously at the psychological fallout of the decisions he was making in the moment, it failed because Nolan was attempting to keep his Oppenheimer character morally and psychologically ambiguous. Thus, without certainty as to his emotional and psychological state, we couldn't receive these ominous warnings, nor did they ring true if we couldn't certainly determine the nature of the individual who was, perhaps, dismissing them. In my humble opinion, a better way to tell the story would have been from within the security clearance reevaluation hearing. The opening of the film could have been the days when Oppenheimer, his lawyers, his friends, his wife were all trying to prepare him for the hearing. The opening scene could have been the instance at Louis Strauss's house when Oppenheimer was alerted to the fact that accusations had been made against him. We could have then had several scenes that could slowly but steadily build tension in anticipation of the hearing, hints at possible betrayals by friends and colleagues, while other friends looked on grieved as this cruel deed was carried out, all while his lawyers struggled to learn the details of what had called into question Oppenheimer's trustability. There was some really fascinating behind-the-scenes scheming taking place that would have translated really well to a fictionalized narrative, something not unlike a courtroom drama. That said, courtroom dramas do traditionally tend to end well, and this hearing did not end well for Oppenheimer. But that need not deter the writer. There is a rich story and a true one in the ultimate ambiguous tragedy of Oppenheimer's fall from power. However, as Nolan filmed it, this hearing was an absolute mess. It felt like reading an erratic first draft. A lot of good pieces were present, but the order in which it took place was strange. There wasn't enough data to make us understand or care about certain crucially important aspects of the proceedings. The Chevalier incident, for example. And the fact that the audience doesn't all know this information isn't because they're stupid, but because the story is told very poorly. And dismissing critical reviewers' complaints about this film being confusing or boring as merely the whining of stupid people is like those teachers who pride themselves on having a lot of students who can't pass their class, little realizing, apparently, that this indicates a failure on their part as teachers, or in this case, a failure on Nolan's part as a storyteller. If the narrative had been built around the reevaluation hearing, as I personally believe it should have been, this type of contextual information, the details that would circumvent the audience's possible confusion, could have been conveyed with relative ease. Oppenheimer could have been shown to be unfocused but confident in his own concrete place in the political scheme of things. And then, while his lawyers, friends, and wife labored to focus him on the task at hand, they could have worked through a narratively organic recollection of Oppenheimer's life, and of the various topics that were doubtless going to be brought up in the course of the hearing. A hearing that they, at least, could see would be a comprehensive weaponization of his entire biography. In the course of this strategizing, we could have shifted into the past to reveal these events from Oppenheimer's biography that were so formative, and that had made him so famous and infamous. This would have provided the narrative brickwork, the context, for the biographical timeline that led up to and through the Manhattan Project, which in turn could have reinforced the relevance and building drama of the security hearing timeline. They could have introduced interpersonal relationships in the past that, during the hearing, would fall apart, and also shed light on key moments from his academic or professional career that were crucial to the hearing. In addition to an illuminating level of clarity, using this kind of pacing provides rhythm to a story that doesn't have its own organically. Key moments, such as the critical so-called Chevalier incident, could have been told in tandem with the moments of the hearing in which they took center stage, with each providing a mini-arc, a kind of pacing hill that the narrative would traverse, each being steeper and more dramatic than the last, providing a gentle pacing tempo that would give the story natural momentum. For instance, the scene in which Oppenheimer humiliated Strauss in front of Congress should have been delivered at the crest of a pacing hill, as the culmination in a tensely depicted uncertain friendship between two arrogant and politically powerful men. Strauss himself could have made appearances in the security hearing timeline, and then too in the course of the biographical timeline. But the cues in the security hearing timeline that recall to Oppenheimer's mind his past with Strauss could have been delivered during his interactions with him leading up to the hearing when he appeared to be an ally, showing flashbacks of this relationship gradually falling apart in a way that Oppenheimer alone failed to perceive would make for a far better narrative path to the reveal that Strauss was the one pulling the strings behind the gray board. And in fact, the entire black and white Strauss timeline in which he plays the big bad slimy politician villain should have been completely scrapped, partly because it did terrible damage to the flow and rhythm of the rest of the story, and partly because it wasn't necessary, given that the events relayed by it, the relevant ones anyway, could have easily been shown in the timeline with the security hearing, especially if you consider that it was William Borden's actions that forced the hearing to even take place. William Borden, by the way, and this was never made clear, was the former executive director of the Joint Congressional Committee on Atomic Energy. Not that Nolan thought we needed to know that. The letter that Borden sent that got the ball rolling for the hearing was to the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, though it did eventually make it to the desk of President Eisenhower. Historically speaking, Strauss didn't give Oppenheimer's damning security file to Borden. He wouldn't have done that politically. He wouldn't have wanted any of that information anywhere in the open. This security file was probably the one, at least in part, that had been shipped to the FBI by Leslie Groves, and which Hoover was deliberately keeping on a shelf too high for Senator McCarthy to reach, because anyone back then with 2/5 of a brain knew that it would be a political disaster for McCarthy to start publicly tearing into Oppenheimer. Everyone in Oppenheimer's radius would be damaged, from Louis Strauss all the way up to the Oval Office. For his part, Borden seemed like a true believer and not a political puppet, but this is all getting dangerously close to an analysis of historical accuracy, and as I've already mentioned, not my area. Here's the thing, though. I don't really care from a storytelling perspective what actually happened. I mean, I care, but we're talking story here, not history. And from the perspective of story, the entire silly plot with Strauss actually makes no sense. It is a fact that historically Strauss didn't want there to be a hearing. Logically, from a storytelling perspective, this relatively meaningless detail is important because it makes more sense than the version Nolan has written. It's not important whether or not Nolan's version is or isn't historically accurate, although it is telling that it's not historically accurate because logically it simply wouldn't have happened that way. Strauss had actually hoped that Oppenheimer would quietly resign, removing the need for a hearing, but accomplishing his own desired goal, a political world without Oppenheimer, with little to no bloodshed or attention, which makes more logical sense anyway. There's that terrible line in Strauss's timeline when that younger man finally realized that Strauss was behind Oppenheimer's humiliating crucifixion, and he says something like, "Borden was holding the knife for you." Strauss hadn't wanted a knife to even be necessary. A politician getting rid of a political rival will want to make sure not just that his fingerprints aren't on the murder weapon, but that no one thinks a murder has even taken place. Borden writing his letter almost ruined all of Strauss's plans. I have a pretty big problem with Nolan's reinterpretation of the nefarious scheming behind the security hearing that destroyed Oppenheimer, not because it is a grossly inaccurate understanding of the historical nuances of the events, but because it actually made very little logical political sense. Nolan created a fictional political scheme to bizarrely replace a very similar political scheme that already existed and attempted to staple it to non-fiction facts that were only loosely present in his film's narrative. His narrative claimed that Borden was doing Strauss's bidding when he sent the letter that created the need for a hearing. But logically, if Strauss had discredited Oppenheimer publicly, it would, among other things, also discredit himself, since he was the one who installed Oppenheimer in such a prestigious political position after the war. The hearing was a huge political risk for him that he didn't need to take because he had already had a plan in place that would get rid of Oppenheimer without anyone, including Oppenheimer, knowing that he was being got rid of. And the end of the whole film, when it comes out that Strauss was behind the actions of the Grey Board, is the very reason why he didn't want to take that risk. This was an area where Nolan pulled entire pieces of fiction out of his hat in an effort to make the story more dramatic, which is fine, he's welcome to do that, but his version lacks logic and any sense of political nuance. It feels like the silly, half-wrought villain scheme in a cheap paperback sword and sorcery novel from the 70s, right down to the way Nolan gave Strauss an evil supervillain monologue. The idea that Strauss was some black-caped goon, evil enough and important enough to warrant his own timeline is very doubtful. Instead, his scheming and backroom manipulations regarding the hearing could have been shown or hinted at within the security hearing timeline itself, lending it its own drama and narrative arc as Oppenheimer and his allies slowly arrived at this truth, powerless though they were to do anything about it. And as for showing Strauss's own downfall during his own timeline, this was messy and careless storytelling. This story isn't about Strauss. We don't need to know during the course of the film how he fared. If that information had been really important to Nolan, he could have relayed it with a card and some text before the end credits like everyone else who makes historical films. If Nolan had really wanted to make an unnecessary supervillain arc with Borden as a subordinate goon to Strauss's goon king, he should have devoted more space to Borden in one or more of his 3 timelines. God knows he had no concerns about economy. As it was, Borden's motivations were never made clear. His associations were never made clear. His identity and character were vague and ambiguous. If Nolan had had a better understanding of the political landscape of the time, or of politics in general, he could have written Borden as someone who was deeply unsettled by the presence of a person he deemed a significant security threat on the AEC, or in the political sphere at all. And he could have been angry that Strauss was failing to forcibly remove Oppenheimer for merely political self-preservation. And so Borden could have drafted his letter to Hoover with full knowledge that it would damage Strauss as well. This could have been part of his intent, to indirectly implicate Strauss, at which point Strauss would be forced to see to it that the security hearing had the desired effect, but without, he hoped, implicating himself very much or at all. And the fact that, for several years, he seemed to have gotten away with that could have made Borden angry. If Nolan had wanted, he could have made Borden the one who made Dr. David Hill aware that Strauss had been behind the entire security hearing, which could have been a kind of cool way to tie a fictional bow on something that had no real bows of any kind. I mean, if he refused to scrap the Strauss timeline, then he should have at least made it worth the audience's time and attention. As it was, William Borden, like so many other important pieces of the narrative, was a very small character in this film, who was mentioned only vaguely and with insufficient context during Strauss's timeline, and who made only one appearance during an unknown point in Oppenheimer's biographical timeline. Besides that, the relevance of Borden's letter to Hoover as the thing that set off the security reevaluation hearing is never ever made sufficiently clear. I didn't myself completely understand the relevant protocol or the sequence of events until I looked into the actual history as it occurred. Moreover, these relevant protocols and sequences of events are introduced, begun, and then interrupted for some other narrative line which launches us back into wartime at the Manhattan Project, further damaging the audience's grasp not just of the sequential order of events, but of the causes and effects. None of which, by the way, was fully comprehensible to me even after several watches, until I spent the better part of a month thoroughly researching all aspects of these events and the people involved, which isn't even my area of historical interest, so I'm still a little annoyed about it. This brings us to Nolan's second major storytelling problem: contextual ambiguity. One of the things I noticed throughout the film was that you can't really appreciate the portrayed events unless you already know the history. But if you already know the history, then you can't really appreciate the portrayed events. The film's story and environment were not self-sustaining, which is a big reason why people with historical knowledge of the era find it so frustrating. Because if only half the context is on screen and it's supposed to be supported by historical facts, but those historical facts are manifestly wrong, the whole film collapses like a house of cards. Reliance on erroneous historical details is magically no longer a storytelling problem if you make your narrative entirely self-contained and self-sufficient. Nolan failed in this by accidentally keeping a lot of details and facts extremely contextually unclear. And again, look elsewhere for an in-depth analysis of the historical aspects of this film. I'm here to explain why this lack of self-contained contextual certainty made this story so bad. For one thing, events were revealed in a strange sequence, as if Nolan was relying on his audience's knowledge of history to reinforce his narrative with the hard facts that he was choosing not to relate, for whatever reason. Not the least of which was a contextualizing date, which was wholly absent from the entire film beginning to end. This speaks to the idea that Nolan wasn't so much interested in telling a story as he was in conveying a sense of his character's mind and soul, perhaps. Which might even make a good film under the right circumstances, but is objectively always going to be the wrong choice when it comes to biopics. Oppenheimer's life is data-heavy, more so than, say, the life of Henry David Thoreau, for example. If we're expected to follow the story as Nolan wants to tell it, we're going to need a lot of hard facts, and we're going to need to understand the relevance of those facts and how they fit into the history of the world, the history of science, and the history of atomic politics at the time. So unless he intended to hand out a booklet with every ticket, he'd need to convey that information within the narrative. And if nothing else, please, for the love of God, give us a date or two. This lack of context went as far as many of the top-billed characters, who were presented as if Nolan expected us to already have a working encyclopedic knowledge of all the major and minor players of the American mid-century physics and nuclear science scene. Countless individuals were presented with just a nickname, or a first name, or no name at all, and a significant amount of admittedly easy historical sleuthing was required for me to understand who everyone was and why they were relevant. The idea, however, that I had to do that represented a gross mishandling of the most basic requirements of storytelling. And yes, it is difficult to put forward a tremendous amount of historical context in the course of a fictional narrative without it coming across like the writer striding into the frame and addressing the audience. But it is possible. Hard, but possible. I've seen historical films in which a character is introduced and a non-invasive card appears briefly on the screen, relaying the character's name and occupation. Even this is preferable to no context at all. Context allows the audience to have a handhold, and with this many characters and too many timelines, handholds are crucial. Context isn't just historical or chronological, it's also part of character building. A character's actions need context in order for those actions to be used to define the character. If a character is depicted with blood on his hands, the meaning is different if he's a surgeon or a serial killer. Those are the context. In fiction, these choices are left entirely up to the writer depending on the type of character they want to construct. In works based on nonfiction, these contextual character development choices have to serve the story or the audience's understanding of the character. Thus, even if the event or the context is historically inaccurate, it has to be true to who the person was at that point in their life, or it has to serve to help the audience understand how that character is developing. In a way, aside from his scientific awareness and the facts of his life, I feel that Nolan's interpretation of Oppenheimer was unchanged throughout the film. He was at the same development point in Cambridge as he was before the AEC Gray Board. He might have said that he was different in one way or another, but the portrayal on screen was consistent with his character during the hearing and during the Manhattan Project. We had only the state of his hair to signal aging. A lot of development was lost in the haphazard pacing created by all the timelines, and a lot was lost by simply beginning with a strangely ambiguous sense of context. That is, Nolan's decision about what information the audience needed in order to contextualize the events happening on screen and the people to whom they were happening. The swirling, heady way in which the feverish nature of his academic life was portrayed failed to get at any kind of character foundation, and instead of hard facts, the audience is then offered only these repeated imaginings of Oppenheimer's scientific hallucinations, interspersed with cinematic landscapes of his string of colleges and universities, and the occasional soundless shot of another professor at a chalkboard, all within a building orchestral crescendo that would suggest a certain narrative peak. But all this was, at best, an emotional array of gauzy set dressing, within which, inexplicably, Oppenheimer's obvious instability and misery was somehow mitigated with each new European slice of theoretical physics pie, until he returned to America fortified with the sense of mission that accompanied his desire to bring this science back to his own people. Somehow, though we don't know how, he is freed from the crushing weight of whatever ambiguous instability had been ambiguously threatening to ruin him, as if the science itself was healing him. Somehow, though we don't know how, he achieves not just stability but recognition and acclaim, enough to earn him multiple respected teaching positions. One would think that the details of his rise to respected prominence within the theoretical physics world would be, perhaps, a useful piece of information, but apparently not. How, indeed, did this man go from injecting cyanide into an apple for Patrick Blackett in Cambridge to writing papers that were so admired by Heisenberg that the latter was suggesting a collaboration? We don't get to know. The journey across the night of Oppenheimer's academic awakening is played out with a mere smattering of scraps, wrapped in a stunningly gorgeous casing of absolutely useless nothing. A beautiful visual masterpiece of nothing, but nothing all the same. And as would repeatedly prove ruinous to Nolan's attempts at character development, all of this narrative distance would be traveled from some claustrophobic position within Oppenheimer's head, robbing the audience of any kind of context or sense of the world that he had begun to actively affect. Additionally, this narrative distance was also repeatedly interrupted by forays into the black and white Strauss timeline, within which we were offered a number of disorienting peeks at Oppenheimer circa 1947, 1948, 49, somewhere in there. Who can say for sure without a history book? And of course, several equally ill-timed interruptions to return us to the still uncontextualized security reevaluation hearing. Once Oppenheimer is planted in America, once he begins to meet many of the individuals who would play a large part in his future and in the film's narrative, the choices Nolan made to further his development of his Oppenheimer character experienced no significant improvement. First of all, by making Oppenheimer the main character of his own life story, he forced a score of other interesting characters to be largely irrelevant, except for when they brushed up against him. Of course, he was the main character, but when I say they were irrelevant, most of them never even spoke their names. Who they were outside of Oppenheimer's awareness didn't even seem to exist. The Dr. Lawrence of the radiation laboratory in Berkeley was introduced along with, "We're building a machine to accelerate electrons." He therefore gets the distinction of being the only scientist, other than Oppenheimer himself, whose field, area of specific interest, and contribution to the history of science is even alluded to. A flimsy kind of children's book illusion, but an illusion all the same. But as more and more individuals joined the Manhattan Project, the lack of information that the audience was being offered became increasingly glaring. Many of the scientists who would prove crucial to the Manhattan Project were never introduced by name, much less specialty or area. Some, such as Edward Teller, were introduced by merely their first name, with their full name being given much later and without solidly linking it to the character himself. If we were lucky, as in the case of Chicago's Dr. Fermi, we got an introduction that included the last name. However, given the nature of this sound, these last names were often easy to miss, and they were almost never repeated. I could allow that this was a creative choice to demonstrate Nolan's interpretation of Oppenheimer as self-absorbed, egotistical, and narcissistic, none of which characterizations to this degree I believe to be strictly fair, but to present the entire film from this warped perspective suggests that the portrayal of the facts themselves may be flawed by Oppenheimer's inflated sense of self-importance. It also reinforces his inflated sense of self-importance, whether true to life or not. Moreover, the workings and sometimes schemings of these various unnamed characters is often vaguely alluded to by their names only. However, which faces belong to the names from among the many unnamed faces we've been watching on screen are very unclear, if they're known at all, which tells me that Nolan didn't deliberately intend for this much uncertainty. It was simply something he did poorly or forgot about altogether. In effect, Nolan was so absorbed, almost obsessed with the Oppenheimer character he was creating, that the very idea that other characters might be relevant or important barely registered. Including them in the story felt almost like an afterthought. So trapped was his perspective behind the nose of his Oppenheimer that everyone else was sorely neglected. In contrast, let's look at a much better biopic, the brilliant Joe Wright film Darkest Hour about Winston Churchill. Wright made a decision with this film that was so inspired I began to wonder if it was the only acceptable way to present a biopic. He used the character of Elizabeth Leighton, Churchill's secretary, a slightly fictionalized version of Churchill's actual secretary, to serve as a kind of every man or every woman on whose shoulders we could perch as she was drawn quite by chance into the orbit of Churchill's life. The story is told often from her perspective, which is brilliant for a number of reasons. First, it removes the pressure from the main subject, that is Churchill, who no longer needs to carry the film so much as occupy it. The space filled by him is the space seen by Miss Leighton. Additionally, framing Churchill's life in the view of this outsider allowed Wright to remove himself just enough from the inside of Churchill's mind. Instead, he took a step back and allowed the viewer to observe him from the outside, as Miss Leighton had done, thereby making their own interpretations and judgments. Churchill, like Oppenheimer, has become a figure figure that is larger than life. To say that it's possible to thoroughly know either of them now, when they have been dead for decades and their memory has metastasized into a marble monolith in the main thoroughfares of global history, isn't just absurd, it's arrogant. Wright understood this, Nolan did not. In many ways, Churchill, while the main subject of Darkest Hour, was not the main character. This allowed the other characters, both fictional and historical, room to exist outside the interpretation and perception of Churchill. Therefore, more of the story could be told from more perspectives for a fuller and more interesting picture. Thus, Churchill is portrayed to be probably the most crucial, but definitely not the most important character in the story, just as he wasn't the most important character in that time in history. If you think about it, a wonderful alternative way to tell the story of Oppenheimer might have been through a fictional scientist at the Manhattan Project who, perhaps, could have started as one of Oppenheimer's first students at Berkeley, who then could have remained by Oppenheimer's side all the way through the security hearing before the Gray Board. This non-existent scientist could have been the narrative device whose questions, what does that mean, why is this scientific discovery relevant, I don't understand how this device is expected to work, and so on, could allow Nolan the opportunities to explain the science in a way that wasn't too overt or redolent of the classroom. He could have been present for arguments about ethics, disagreements regarding the science. He could have witnessed the moral turmoil of Oppenheimer in a way that would have made the man's character clearer to the audience than if any factual character had spoken it aloud. He could have provided a narrative ball of string to guide us through the twists and turns of Oppenheimer's life. Like Emily Watson's brilliant Olana Homyuk in Chernobyl, such a fictional creation could have served as a way to highlight the many, many significant individuals who were present in Los Alamos during that time, but who could not be individually named and represented for want of narrative space or time. Also, it's worth noting, using the character of Olana Homyuk in the place of dozens of other scientists served to simplify an immensely complex story in a way that balanced it and made it clearer to relate, something the Oppenheimer film sorely needed. The bottom line here is that aside from the horrendous damage done to development by this disjointed timeline situation, this needlessly acute focus on Oppenheimer and only Oppenheimer damages the narrative's ability to progress both the character and the story. But even more than that, Nolan's horrible failure to provide even a single ounce of context was, all by itself, enough to destroy this film 3 or 4 times over. One terrible example. This man was never named or introduced by title or profession even once until he came forward with his damning testimony against Louis Strauss in Strauss's timeline, at which point we finally learned that he was Dr. David Hill. Nolan didn't even bother to tell us at this point Dr. Hill was the chairman of the Federation of American Scientists, to contextualize why he was even there, to speak about how the scientific community would view the appointment of Strauss as Secretary of Commerce. Upon his appearance at this time, the audience was meant to perceive him as significant only in regards to his previous appearances, which were, as far as anyone could tell, as some kind of secretary of Dr. Fermi, with no direct connection to Strauss or Oppenheimer. This was an excellent example of Nolan's disastrous lack of context. When this individual came forward at Strauss's nomination hearing and started speaking out in favor of Oppenheimer and against Strauss, the scene was climactic, possibly the most significant climax of the entire film. But the audience had been given no context. Who was this man? Who did he work for? What was his character, his personality, his connection to Oppenheimer or Strauss? Why was it assumed that he would speak in favor of Strauss? Why instead did he choose to betray him? Why, in other words, should the audience care? Without any context, the answer to that question is a giant blank spot. The transcript of Louis Strauss's nomination hearing before the Committee on Interstate and Foreign Commerce is available for public viewing and clocks in at just under 1,150 pages. Dr. Hill's testimony takes approximately 73 pages. Side note, it is a pretty interesting, if very dense read, and gets into something that Nolan's film fails to do, which is that Strauss's handling of the Oppenheimer security hearing alienated almost the entire scientific community, which was, it's worth noting, a major reason why Strauss had wanted to avoid Oppenheimer's hearing in the first place. However, unless Oppenheimer had intended to magic some more fiction out of his magical fiction hat to make this more narratively meaningful, relevant, or at least contextualized in some framework, Beyond a loose climactic conclusion to his pointless Strauss timeline, it was not well suited to a film's narrative unless that film's chosen perspective featured prominently the character of Dr. David Hill. Which brings us to another closely related problem: framing. Just as in writing a novel, a filmmaker must, like the novelist, choose his story's perspective. This choice is based on a number of things, but just as in literature, it comes down to what I like to call framing. I mentioned this a little earlier when I was talking about what angle a writer wants to take when telling a story based on historical facts. But any story, fictional or based on fact, has to have some sort of structure that can fit between the covers or between the credits. It has to have some kind of narrative arc, some kind of cohesive shape. For a nonfiction story, especially, that is accomplished with framing. You pick an aspect of the story that you want to convey, and you build the structure of your narrative around that, and you do not stray outside the box. Whatever you want to call this, framing, theme, etc. I hesitate to use the term theme because the implications are too ambiguous, even if that is, technically speaking, the most accurate term. I think of it more as the ultimate narrative question. A story always asks a question. It doesn't always answer it, but the story itself is always some kind of question. For Darkest Hour, it was, how did Churchill lead Britain into war against Hitler? That was the solid ground, the brick path through the forest that Wright had to stay firmly fixed to, lest his narrative get away from him. A good deal of the film Oppenheimer can only be explained if you imagine it as being a response to something, as if Nolan heard someone say something at a swanky dinner party one too many times and decided he had to respond to it. The book upon which this film was largely based is the same way. One gets the impression from both that the writers and Nolan felt themselves somehow duty-bound to remind the world of an apparently contested fact: that J. Robert Oppenheimer was a flawed human being. This starting point is only pertinent or interesting if you're coming into the story from the perspective that the nuclear bomb's creators are the embodiment of peak human evil, that the existence of atomic weapons is itself an unforgivable sin for which someone has to be held accountable, or you believe that Oppenheimer was some kind of sainted science god who was publicly crucified by the AEC. In spite of the fact that the average viewer does not maintain such a dichotomous view of any historical figure, much less the controversial individual who midwifed atomic weaponry, the film was still put together with the apparently intended audience being one who has been operating under the delusion that the man Oppenheimer was either the sworn servant of Satan or he was as pure as the driven snow. And Nolan, moved as he was by the Spirit, had taken it upon himself to remind all of us that Oppenheimer was, in fact, human. Thus, we were treated for hours to a series of disconnected anecdotes about his flawed marriage, his questionable moral judgment when it came to fidelity, his reckless approach to politics, his political and social views, his occasionally contentious relationship with family, his prickly personality, his arrogance, his stubbornness, his ego, his brilliance, his self-awareness, his patriotism, his emotional instability. The audience will take all this in, trying to find the narrative thread that weaves it all together, over and above it being pieces of his life and his personality. Certain disjointed scenes could only be explained if they were intended to serve this sole purpose. The brief sequence, for example, when Oppenheimer and his wife Kitty found themselves too overwhelmed to care for their infant son, and so left him with a family friend while they took a vacation on their ranch. This is, I'm sure, to some extent, a true representation of the complex nature of both Oppenheimer's marriage and his difficulty with fatherhood. But it served no narrative purpose. It loosely and flimsily added a few details to the type of friendship Oppenheimer had with Chevalier, which was somewhat relevant to the Chevalier incident. But beyond that, which could have been accomplished countless other ways, it served no purpose. If perhaps the film had taken the approach to the subject of Oppenheimer, of his children's or his family's perspective of him, this could have made sense. If the entire film, the war, the Manhattan Project, the social, political, and scientific prestige that followed, and the ultimate fall from grace, had been told, for instance, from the perspective of his wife and children, Using this piece of Oppenheimer's personal life as a scene in the film makes sense. Another example is the existence of Jean Tatlock in the film's narrative. Jean Tatlock, I'm sure you know, was Oppenheimer's communist mistress, a somewhat unstable woman with whom he carried on an extramarital affair up to and during part of the Manhattan Project. Her arc within his arc and her ultimate tragic end seemed to Nolan to be tremendously important, but there was no thread connecting it to the rest of the story. Sure, it's brought up again here and there as a reference to his infidelity, or as a general judgment for or against his sense of loyalty, but it doesn't seem connected to any other thing that Nolan has chosen to feature, unless the point of her is to prove that Oppenheimer was both caring and selfish, loyal and disloyal. But to make use of Jean to serve this end requires a great deal of the rest of the film's narrative to proceed along this path. If, for example, Nolan had chosen to tell the story of Oppenheimer entirely from the perspective of his marriage with Kitty, this would have been both relevant and helpful. In either of these ideas, the tragedy of Jean Tatlock or Oppenheimer's strained relationship with marriage and fatherhood could have been useful if the overall theme of the film had been the personal fallout of his life, the human toll, the friendships lost and the marriages destroyed and the children broken. And to some extent, maybe 60% of the time, this sort of seems like the path Nolan has chosen, but ultimately it is not. And so again and again, the audience is struggling to find the path Nolan is supposed to be carving through the wilds, but are repeatedly getting lost in the weeds. All of these scenes on their own have value, but a filmmaker, a storyteller, has to carefully choose which scenes to keep and which to cut, not just because of economy, but because the story has to follow a guided path. Even if a scene is beautiful, even if it clarifies a character or a situation, it can actually confuse or muddle your narrative if it doesn't serve it completely and better than any other scene could have. And as an aside here, to continue using Darkest Hour as an example, within that film's narrative, Wright also managed to nod once or twice at the flawed nature of his subject's personal life and personality, despite the fact that that wasn't within the framing he had chosen to use. He did this with carefully positioned moments within other narratively relevant scenes. For example, during the family's personal celebration upon Churchill's appointment as Prime Minister, his wife made a little speech in which she alluded to the sacrifices that they had all had to make by being part of Churchill's life. His son and daughters are shown in brief flashes to bear the expressions of children whose relationship with their father has been both strained and damaging. The scene served the narrative purpose of being a crucial step along the path to Britain's role in World War II, because now Churchill was Prime Minister. It also served to shine a little light on Churchill's own wavering confidence. But within these narratively essential scenes, Wright sprinkled a little extra information. Not enough to distract from the main story, but enough to add a wealth of depth to his subject. The way and the timing with which the audience is informed of Churchill's complicated relationship with his family reinforces the tension Wright had been building for the entire film up to this point, which was Churchill's lacking interpersonal skills, which could undermine his ultimate goal, convincing his government to resist Hitler. Not even his family found him likable all the time. How would he ever convince the entire British government, the king, and the people to follow him into a war? This is accomplished again during one of Churchill's lunches with the king. His relationship with King George was a crucial aspect of the main story, whether or not Britain would bend to Hitler or resist him. But there was tension there because Churchill lacked the social graces expected in those times, and the king found both his judgment and his character unsatisfactory, and was inclined to disagree with any of his decisions on the grounds that his appointment had come at the expense of a man the king greatly respected. Yet, during one of their mandatory lunches, a little exchange of personal information that the narrative didn't really need served to both illuminate the subject of Winston Churchill and soften the relationship between the two men, which would, in turn, inform the ultimate story. For Oppenheimer, it was really difficult to determine what Nolan wished to convey. Is it possible that it really was Oppenheimer a monster or a tragic genius? Which, while possibly interesting, I guess, isn't enough to carry an entire film. At least not this one. What could it have been? Perhaps, if the story relied more on the narrative structure of the security hearing and the idea that the average American viewer likely doesn't know any details about that, one could pose the question for the film's story as, how will Oppenheimer be judged? Referring, of course, to the outcome of the hearing, but leaving space thematically for a larger question to be posed about his legacy and his place in history. For most of the time, I'd say about 40 to 70% of the film, depending on how certain things are interpreted, the emphasis of the narrative is on an in-depth and meticulous examination of Oppenheimer's politics. Specifically his communist associations, his communist friends, the communist social gatherings he went to, etc., etc. The film, I think, is trying to support its, and the book American Prometheus's, belief that Oppenheimer's fall from grace was brought about almost entirely because of a prejudice against communism within the US government, or at least certain aspects of the US government. Whether or not this is true is irrelevant to the story. But this small corner of a massive story was given far, far too much relevance. There's a wealth of information available about the security reevaluation hearing that gets into the more complex nuances of the matter over and above communism, communism, communism. But putting aside what was or wasn't true, all this emphasis on the communism of it all forced Nolan to frame almost the entirety of the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer's life, and the atomic thumbprint he left on the world from this one sole, all-important perspective. A perspective which wasn't even clear. Was Oppenheimer being treated cruelly at the security reevaluation hearing because he was a communist? Or was his treatment at the hearing cruel and unwarranted because he wasn't even a communist? Was the security at the Manhattan Project faulty because everyone was a communist? Or was the security only deemed faulty because everyone was paranoid about communists? This character or that character was depicted as a good, moral person because they were a communist. But then also, this or that character could prove that they were moral and trustworthy because they had left the Communist Party. Strauss was seen to be histrionic regarding security issues at Los Alamos, given Oppenheimer's political proclivities, but then later it was revealed that there had been security leaks at Los Alamos. It was a bizarre and confusing swirl of messages that seemed to come from some central idea that Nolan believed self-evident and thus never shared with the rest of us. Was it that Oppenheimer, a good and noble leftist, had been the most prominent crucified American communist? Was it that Oppenheimer wasn't even a communist at all, but that the communist paranoia still destroyed him anyway? Was it that the communist associations he was forced to abandon were another noble sacrifice he was forced to make by the big bad United States Armed Forces? Or was it that he was being childish, naive, and reckless in maintaining these associations, given the state of the world at the time? For one thing, Nolan's story and the dialogue and sequence of events depicted portray Oppenheimer's decision to break things off with Jean Tatlock, the communist mistress, as being forced upon him by the fact that he needed to abide by the rules of his security clearance. Thus, when Jean asked him why he couldn't tell her what project he was working on, he answered, "Because you're a communist." Which explicitly suggested that if the random woman with whom he was having an affair was not a communist, he would be more than welcome to divulge the details of the Manhattan Project to her while they lounged naked in some swanky hotel. To further confuse, the narrative involving Jean Tatlock was made even more complicated by the heavily veiled insinuation that she had been murdered, which might even be true and is certainly interesting, but fails, like every other individual storyline, to slip into some narrative groove that Nolan needed to construct for it. It is possible that communism in all its pomps and works need not have been such a central theme of this film. Of course, it is true that most films made by Hollywood taking place in the time immediately after the Second World War tend to be dominated to some degree by talks about communism this and communism that. But Nolan seemed to think that communism, again, without any context, political, historical, or social, was so important that he had to shoehorn it into each and every aspect of this story. This was a story in which Adolf Hitler received frequent mentions, and yet Oppenheimer's Judaism was treated with less importance than his maybe, maybe not relationship with the Communist Party. I have seen propaganda films made by the People's Republic of China that didn't make the Communist Party this prominent. But remember, what we're talking about here is framing. The central theme of a story that gives it cohesion. Without a doubt, whether or not Oppenheimer was a communist was never the central theme of this film, but the question and all its attendant issues was given such importance that the true theme, whatever that might have been, got lost. Such a question was certainly an aspect of Oppenheimer's life and his downfall, but it was just one aspect, and anyone who watches this film will be wholly unaware that any other factors were ever present in his life. I could go on and on detailing many of the individual mini-arcs and small fragmentary storylines that were sprinkled seemingly at random throughout this 3-hour cinematic monstrosity, but at some point the analysis becomes more effort than it's worth. And if I'm being honest, if I have to watch this film one more time, I'm going to put my head through a plate glass window. Each misstep, each jumbled attempt at rhythmic pacing and cohesive plot development failed for these reasons. Excessive timelines and complexity, which represented Nolan's uncertainty about where the solid foundation of his story even was to start with. Horribly uneven pacing, a direct result of the first problem. A complete lack of context in any shape or form, and no clarity or even effort to establish clarity regarding the story's theme or framing. All of these problems are fatal, but they're also fixable. They're easy to avoid if you go into your storytelling with a firm grasp on the basic essentials of what any good story must have in order to be solid, if nothing else. And if your story is solid, it will already be better than this 3-hour, $100 million disaster that has been forced onto the general public. Thank you for watching to the end. Until next time.